I saw you recently acquired, was it Cubby?
Yes. Yeah.
As
Yeah.
well. What was that like?
Interesting. I mean, it was fun. So they're an American business, like relatively much smaller. And really we were focused on picking up like more locations that they worked with around Texas and some cities that we're already in, like Las Vegas and parts of New York and stuff. And I mean, it was interesting kind of negotiating it. It was, I mean, it's because they were a relatively small business. It wasn't like typical M&A, and we could really value it a lot on like, okay, how many points are we getting, as in storage locations are we getting?
Yeah.
How much SEO traffic do you have? And like legally, it was much simpler because they were basically just selling the assets and then wrapping up the shell of the company. But it was, I mean, it was fun. It's an experience that I would like to do more of. Like, I think as we kind of start to have some profits to look at to invest in stuff, like M&A is an obvious thing to do.
And so how long was this acquisition in the works for?
Actually, interestingly, like a very long time. I think the first email probably like a year or two ago.
Okay.
There's lots of competitors in the space that we, like both companies that are similar size, smaller companies, not direct competitors because there aren't larger companies, but in other spaces, larger companies, their corp dev teams and stuff, you want to keep relationships going for quite a long time. Couple of reasons. One, builds trust. People get to know you. And two, the other thing is you build lines. So one piece of advice I got from an investor at some point was investors invest in lines, not dots. And if you have a continuous relationship over time, they see how things are changing. They see the line rather than a specific point, a dot.
Yeah.
So quite a while. I didn't ask you earlier, but I wanted to ask you because yours is quite a different business model. How did COVID affect you guys?
For us, it accelerated things. There was this whole move towards building, an online presence for yourself, particularly amongst founders and CEOs. And so the entire, offline networking piece and building your reputation, credibility in person just disappeared essentially overnight. So there was this huge influx of people who wanted to build their brand. And that was probably the first time we experienced onboarding clients and onboarding team members over Zoom. And it was completely new because we never really did that before. Yeah. But on the whole, it definitely helped us. It really accelerated things.
Damn. And I guess from what I know off the top of my head, the majority of your business's history is actually during COVID then. So pretty much remote.
Around half now. It's crazy. And so it was part remote. And then when we were able to go back into the office, we did. And we're now, hybrid like a lot of companies are.
Yeah,
so
pretty much everyone is, right?
Yeah, we've got an office, but you don't have to be there. But, around half the team tend to come in.
That's fair. Do you set fixed days that you want people in or?
No.
Interesting.
We may need to do that in the future, but for now, I think people appreciate the flexibility. And
interesting.
We have around 5 teams within the business, and those teams work together on different client accounts and different projects.
So you let them just kind of naturally do it themselves?
Yes, they kind of decide it amongst themselves.
I think one thing that we've kind of started doing is, or certainly one thing in terms of like HR policies I learned a while ago, and then specific to this that we started doing is we actually start setting specific days. And we say like, it's flexible, like, you can take other days, but like these are the days that it's like no questions asked, whatever, work from home. Any other day, just like ask, check that there's not something important with your team that you're going to be missing. And then generally with like HR policies, I think it's really tempting as you kind of, it's hard to step out of yourself. I don't know if you've experienced this, like where like you kind of think like, oh, like people can kind of sense what's like right or like, know to just ask me. And then you realize that like people feel uncomfortable asking all the time or like don't sense the same things that you sense. And sometimes it's just easier to be like, here is a very clear policy that you can follow. And then for anything, but it's a small company. So if there's anything around it, just ask.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of it comes down to, I think, what you perceive to be common sense versus what is actually common sense.
Yeah.
So you may think, using a client example, if you're to start working with a client, the common sense thing to do is look the client up, go onto, Google, do some research on them.
Yeah.
But unless you kind of sit somebody down and walk them through the process, this is what you need to do when you start working with a new client. You need to know a certain amount about them.
Yep.
Then it's difficult to feel any type of way if they don't do that, because that's your version of quote unquote common sense.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same with the HR piece as well. And the office policies, you've got to make it really clear.
Yeah.
Because if you just depend on what you think is the right thing to do, there may not be a shared, common sense or shared right thing about it.
Yeah. And it's actually one of those things where like, kind of like your feelings, sometimes being forced to literally express them actually helps you understand them a bit better.
Yeah.
So when you write down your specific process, actually then you can look at the process and be like, oh yeah, I'm definitely missing this thing. I should add it to the written process. Or like with the HR policy, like, you know, when you start to think about like your work from home or your remote working policy, when you actually have to write down specifics, you're like, oh, I hadn't considered this thing that I was kind of naturally feeling, but like maybe that's not a good idea. Which I find,
Yeah. One more question on that acquisition. Did this feel like a huge win? Was this a small win? Was this like a big romantic PR piece opportunity?
I honestly, for us, it was like a positive, opportunistic kind of like, okay, we found someone who had built a business that was doing well, but maybe particularly because of timing with COVID, just hadn't broken through before. And then like to come back and rebuild now, you know, after 2 years of kind of slugging it through, it just kind of made sense for them to kind of join with us. So I'd say like opportunistic, but then like the PR has been really great. And this is a candid podcast. Like their founder is great, but in reality, it was like a relatively small acquisition, a relatively small business. But I guess it kind of communicates like we're serious, like we're active in the M&A space in this area. So it kind of says to, you know, other people have messaged like, hey, saw that you did this, like, let's keep in touch. It kind of communicates that. But, you know, it wasn't, because of the relative scales of the businesses, it wasn't world changing. You know, it's not like, you know, we didn't see like a kind of, whoa, we've doubled our revenue because of this or anything like that. Do
you think that'll be a big part of your strategy going forward, M&A?
I would say so. The reason I say that is you mentioned, for example, the luggage storage stuff is like a specific niche. It's got a high ceiling, like a higher than I think people like may necessarily expect. But ultimately, you know, the ceiling is probably sub like multi-billion revenue. The ceiling is probably more like multi-hundred million revenue. And that's for the entire market. Probably. Well, it might be like $1 billion for the entire market. So then if you want to think like, okay, how do we grow top line revenue? Need to start thinking about how you branch into other services, which could be stuff like integrating delivery into what we're doing. And that's like an operationally complex thing. So maybe it makes sense to look at someone who's already doing that. It could be looking at like leaning more into the like where we create services that help vacation rental managers. Like what are other problems they have? Like which could be stuff like, I don't know, accessing cleaners or like sorting access into locations and stuff, and be like, okay, is that something that we can approach, or is that something that we can think about like an acquisition to kind of bolt on? Which then also, if you think about like an acquirer in the vacation rental space, you know, that makes you more attractive to them because you're addressing two strategic problems for them.